The autumn morning at Windsor Castle carried an unusual chill that seemed to seep through the ancient stone walls and settle into the very bones of those who walked its corridors. Prince George, now 11 years old, had developed a routine that palace staff had grown accustomed to over the past few months. Each morning at precisely 7:30, he would emerge from his private quarters dressed in his school uniform, his young face bearing an expression far too serious for someone his age. On this particular Tuesday, something felt different. The household staff exchanged worried glances as they watched the young prince make his way through the East Wing, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors with an almost mechanical precision. There was no spring in his step, no childlike curiosity that had once characterized his movements through the palace. Instead, Prince George moved like someone carrying an invisible burden, his shoulders slightly hunched as though the weight of future kingship had already settled upon them. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, noticed it first. She had been arranging fresh flowers in the blue drawing room when Prince George passed by the doorway. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and what she saw in the young prince's gaze made her hands tremble slightly as she adjusted the white roses. There was a depth of understanding there, a knowing look that seemed decades beyond his years. The morning proceeded, as usual on the surface. Prince George attended his private tutoring sessions with his governess, Miss Catherine Henderson, a distinguished woman in her 50s who had been carefully selected for her ability to balance academic excellence with the unique requirements of educating a future monarch. During their geography lesson, as they studied the Commonwealth nations, Miss Henderson noticed that Prince George seemed particularly attentive when they discussed the responsibilities that came with leadership. "Your Royal Highness," Miss Henderson had said gently, "you seem quite thoughtful today. Is there something about today's lesson that particularly interests you?" Prince George had looked up from his atlas, his blue eyes reflecting a maturity that sometimes startled even those closest to him. "Miss Henderson," he had replied in his clear, well-modulated voice, "when someone sees something that isn't right, what should they do about it?" The question caught his governess off guard. It wasn't unusual for the young prince to ask thoughtful questions, but there was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't merely academic curiosity. "Well," she had answered carefully, "I suppose it depends on the situation. Sometimes speaking up is the right thing to do. Other times, actions speak louder than words." Prince George had nodded slowly, as though her answer had confirmed something he had already been thinking. He returned his attention to the atlas, but Miss Henderson noticed that he seemed to be studying the pages without really seeing them, his mind clearly occupied with weightier matters. Meanwhile, in another part of Windsor Castle, Detective Chief Inspector Martin Brooks was experiencing what would later be described as the most challenging morning of his distinguished career with the Royal Protection Unit. DCI Brooks had been serving as Prince George's primary protection officer for nearly 2 years, a position he had accepted with great pride and a deep sense of responsibility. At 42 years old, he was considered one of the most capable officers in the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Unit, with an impeccable service record and an unwavering dedication to his duties. But something had been troubling DCI Brooks for weeks now, something that gnawed at his professional conscience and kept him awake at night. It had started with small things, inconsistencies in security protocols, requests from certain palace officials that seemed to contradict established safety procedures, and a growing sense that not everyone around the young prince had his best interests at heart. The previous week, DCI Brooks had been instructed by a senior palace administrator to modify Prince George's security detail during an upcoming public engagement. The changes, while subtle, would have created vulnerabilities that any experienced protection officer would recognize as unacceptable. When DCI Brooks had questioned the modifications, he had been told curtly that the instructions came from the highest levels and were not to be questioned. That morning, as DCI Brooks reviewed the security arrangements for Prince George's planned visit to a local children's hospital later in the week, he discovered additional changes that had been made to the protocols without his knowledge or approval. These modifications were even more concerning than the previous ones, and DCI Brooks realized that someone within the palace hierarchy was deliberately compromising the young prince's security. As Prince George made his way to the library for his afternoon reading period, he passed by DCI Brooks's small office adjacent to the security control room. Through the partially open door, the young prince could see his protection officer hunched over a computer screen, his brow furrowed in concentration and concern. DCI Brooks was studying security footage from recent public engagements, comparing the actual arrangements with what had been officially approved. Prince George paused in the hallway, his keen young mind quickly assessing the situation. Even at 11, he had inherited his family's ability to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. He could see the tension in DCI Brooks's shoulders, the way the officer kept glancing at his phone as though expecting important news, and the neat stack of official documents on his desk that suggested serious deliberations were taking place. Without announcing his presence, Prince George quietly observed his protection officer for several minutes. He watched as DCI Brooks pulled up email communications, cross-referenced security protocols, and occasionally shook his head in what appeared to be disbelief or frustration. The young prince had spent enough time around palace staff to recognize the signs of someone grappling with a difficult decision, someone who was torn between competing loyalties and obligations. DCI Brooks, sensing he was being observed, looked up from his computer screen to find Prince George standing in the doorway. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The protection officer saw something in the young prince's expression that suggested an awareness beyond his years, an understanding that this was more than a casual encounter. "Your Royal Highness," DCI Brooks said, quickly minimizing the documents on his screen and standing respectfully. "I didn't hear you approach. Is there anything you need assistance with?" Prince George stepped into the office, closing the door behind him with a deliberateness that surprised the adult. "DCI Brooks," he said in his clear, serious voice, "my father once told me that the most important quality in the people around us is integrity. He said that without integrity, all other qualities become meaningless." The protection officer felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in the young prince's tone and the timing of his words that suggested this was not a random observation. "Your father is very wise, Your Royal Highness," DCI Brooks replied carefully. "He also told me," Prince George continued, moving to stand directly in front of DCI Brooks's desk, "that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who disappoint us the most. But," he said, "that makes it even more important to recognize and value those who remain true to their principles, even when it's difficult." DCI Brooks found himself looking directly into the young prince's eyes, and what he saw there was both humbling and unsettling. This child, who should have been concerned with schoolwork and play, was clearly aware that something significant was happening around him. More than that, he seemed to be offering some form of encouragement or support, though neither of them could speak directly about the situation. "Your Royal Highness," DCI Brooks said quietly, "is there something specific that's concerning you?" Prince George was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I've noticed that some people around the palace have been behaving differently lately," he finally said. "They smile when they speak to me, but their eyes don't match their smiles. And I've heard conversations that stop suddenly when I enter a room." The protection officer felt his heart rate increase. If Prince George had noticed these things, it meant the situation was even more serious than he had feared. "These are very perceptive observations, Your Royal Highness," he said. "What do you think about these changes you've noticed?" "I think," Prince George said with the kind of clarity that comes from careful consideration, "that when something isn't right, people who care about doing the right thing have to make difficult choices. And I think that sometimes those choices require courage that not everyone possesses." DCI Brooks realized that this 11-year-old boy had just acknowledged the exact dilemma he was facing. Without explicitly discussing the security concerns or the pressure he was under, Prince George had somehow communicated that he was aware of the situation and that he understood the difficult position his protection officer was in. "Your Royal Highness," DCI Brooks said, his voice thick with emotion, "serving you and protecting you has been the greatest honor of my career. I want you to know that, regardless of what happens, my commitment to your safety and well-being will never waver." Prince George nodded solemnly, as though he had expected this response. "I know that, DCI Brooks. And I want you to know that I understand that sometimes protecting someone means making choices that others might not understand or approve of." The weight of that statement settled between them like a challenge and a promise. Here was a child who was already demonstrating the kind of wisdom and moral courage that many adults never develop. DCI Brooks realized that Prince George was not just acknowledging the situation. He was giving his protection officer permission to do what needed to be done, even if it meant significant personal consequences. As Prince George prepared to leave the office, he turned back one final time. "DCI Brooks," he said, "my grandmother once told me that the crown is not just a symbol of power, but a symbol of service. She said that everyone who serves the crown, in any capacity, shares in that responsibility to do what is right, regardless of the cost." After Prince George left, DCI Brooks sat alone in his office, staring at the computer screen that still displayed the compromised security protocols. The young prince's words echoed in his mind, and he realized that his decision had already been made. He could not, in good conscience, continue to serve in a position where he was being prevented from properly protecting the future king. DCI Brooks opened his desk drawer and withdrew a piece of official stationery. His resignation letter would be brief and professional, but it would also be uncompromising. He would not detail the specific security concerns in writing. That would require a separate, more secure communication to his superiors at Scotland Yard. But he would make it clear that he could no longer serve effectively in his current position due to irreconcilable differences regarding security protocols and professional standards. As he began to write, DCI Brooks thought about Prince George's remarkable composure and maturity. The young prince had somehow found a way to communicate his support and understanding without compromising either of them with explicit statements. It was a demonstration of political and personal wisdom that suggested he would indeed grow into the kind of monarch his nation would need. The news of DCI Brooks's resignation spread through Windsor Castle like wildfire, though the official announcement was carefully worded to avoid any hint of controversy. The Palace Communications Office released a brief statement indicating that Detective Chief Inspector Martin Brooks had decided to pursue other opportunities within the Metropolitan Police, and that his service to the royal family had been exemplary and deeply appreciated. But those who worked closely within the palace walls knew that such sudden departures rarely happened without significant underlying reasons. The timing was particularly puzzling, as DCI Brooks had recently received commendations for his service and had given no previous indication of dissatisfaction with his position. Within hours of the announcement, whispered conversations were taking place in every corner of the castle, from the kitchens to the administrative offices. Prince George learned of DCI Brooks's resignation during his morning tutoring session when Miss Henderson received a discreet phone call from the palace private secretary's office. The young prince watched his governess's face carefully as she listened to the information being conveyed, noting the way her eyebrows drew together in surprise and concern. When she hung up the phone, she turned to Prince George with an expression that attempted to mask her confusion. "Your Royal Highness," Miss Henderson said gently, "I'm afraid there will be some changes to your security detail. DCI Brooks has accepted a new position and will no longer be serving as your protection officer. I'm sure you'll be introduced to his replacement very shortly." Prince George received this information with a composure that impressed even his experienced governess. There was no visible reaction, no surprise, no disappointment, no questions about why such a change would happen so suddenly. Instead, he simply nodded and returned his attention to his mathematics workbook, though Miss Henderson noticed that his pencil remained motionless on the page for several long minutes. "Your Royal Highness," she ventured carefully, "DCI Brooks was with us for quite some time. It's perfectly natural if you have questions about this change, or if you'd like to discuss anything about the transition to a new protection officer." Prince George looked up from his workbook, and Miss Henderson was struck once again by the depth of understanding in his young eyes. "Miss Henderson," he said quietly, "sometimes people have to make difficult choices because they believe it's the right thing to do. I think DCI Brooks is a person who always tries to do the right thing." The governess felt a chill at these words. There was something in Prince George's tone that suggested he knew more about the situation than anyone might expect. "That's a very mature way to think about it," she replied. "Do you have any concerns about working with a new protection officer?" "I'm sure whoever is chosen will be very qualified," Prince George said diplomatically. "But I hope they will be someone who understands that protecting someone isn't just about keeping them safe from physical harm. Sometimes the most important protection is making sure that the right people are making decisions about their welfare." Miss Henderson found herself studying Prince George's face intently. These were not the words of a typical 11-year-old, even one being raised in the unique environment of the royal family. There was a sophistication to his thinking and an awareness of complex adult dynamics that was both impressive and somewhat concerning. Meanwhile, in London, DCI Brooks was sitting in the office of Chief Superintendent Rebecca Walsh, the head of the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Unit. The meeting had been arranged within hours of his resignation letter reaching the appropriate channels, and the urgency with which it had been scheduled told DCI Brooks that his concerns were being taken seriously at the highest levels. Chief Superintendent Walsh was a formidable woman in her early 50s, known throughout the Met for her uncompromising standards and her fierce dedication to the safety of the royal family. She had worked her way up through the ranks over 25 years, earning respect through her tactical expertise, her political acumen, and her absolute refusal to compromise on security matters. If anyone would understand DCI Brooks's position, it would be her. Martin, Chief Superintendent Walsh said as she reviewed the confidential report that DCI Brooks had submitted along with his resignation. These are very serious allegations. You're suggesting that someone within the palace hierarchy has been deliberately compromising security protocols for Prince George. Do you understand the implications of what you're telling me? DCI Brooks leaned forward in his chair, his expression grave. Ma'am, I've gone over this situation dozens of times, trying to find alternative explanations. But the pattern is clear and consistent. Someone with significant authority within the palace has been modifying security arrangements in ways that create vulnerabilities. These aren't innocent mistakes or administrative oversights. These are deliberate changes that any experienced protection officer would recognize as unacceptable risks. And you have no direct evidence of who is responsible for these modifications? Chief Superintendent Walsh asked. No direct evidence, no. The orders have always come through intermediaries, and the paper trail has been carefully managed to obscure the original source. But the changes are too sophisticated and too strategically planned to be the work of someone without extensive knowledge of protection protocols. This is being orchestrated by someone with inside access and significant authority. Chief Superintendent Walsh set down the report and studied DCI Brooks intently. Martin, you've had an exemplary career with us. Your record is spotless, and your dedication to the royal family is unquestioned. But I need to ask you directly, is there any possibility that your concerns are being influenced by personal feelings or workplace conflicts? Any reason someone might want you removed from this position? DCI Brooks had expected this question, and he appreciated that his superior was asking it directly rather than dancing around the issue. Ma'am, I've considered that possibility extensively, but the evidence speaks for itself. These security modifications would put Prince George at risk, and I cannot in good conscience continue in a position where I'm being prevented from doing my job effectively. Whether someone specifically wanted me removed, or whether I'm simply an obstacle to whatever larger plan is in motion, I can't say. But I can say with absolute certainty that something is not right. The chief superintendent was quiet for several minutes, processing the information and considering the implications. The Metropolitan Police's relationship with the palace was built on decades of trust and mutual respect, but it was also understood that the police had an independent responsibility to ensure royal security that could not be compromised by palace politics or internal conflicts. I'm going to need you to walk me through every incident in detail, she said finally. Dates, times, who gave you what instructions, what the original protocols were supposed to be, and exactly how they were modified. I want you to document everything you can remember, and I want you to be prepared to present this information to higher authorities if necessary. As DCI Brooks began his detailed account, Chief Superintendent Walsh found herself thinking about the larger implications of what she was hearing. If there was indeed a deliberate attempt to compromise Prince George's security, it raised questions that went far beyond simple palace politics. Who would benefit from putting the young prince at risk? What could be the motivation for such actions? And how high up in the palace hierarchy might this conspiracy reach? Back at Windsor Castle, Prince George was experiencing his first day with his new protection officer, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell. D.I. Mitchell was a highly regarded officer in her mid-30s, with extensive experience in royal protection and a reputation for thorough professionalism. She had been selected for this assignment on very short notice, and while she had been briefed on the basics of Prince George's routine and requirements, she hadn't been given any details about the circumstances of DCI Brooks's departure. Prince George observed his new protection officer with the same careful attention he had developed for reading the adults around him. D.I. Mitchell seemed competent and dedicated, but there was something different in her approach compared to DCI Brooks. She was more formal, more strictly procedural, and she seemed to be following very specific instructions about how to manage his security detail. During the afternoon, as Prince George attended a private piano lesson in the music room, he noticed D.I. Mitchell speaking quietly into her radio more frequently than DCI Brooks had typically done. The conversations were brief and conducted in the kind of coded language that protection officers used, but Prince George had learned to recognize the patterns and rhythms of these communications from his years of observation. What struck him as unusual was not just the frequency of the communications, but the tone of D.I. Mitchell's responses. She seemed to be receiving instructions rather than providing updates, and Her body language suggested a level of tension that hadn't been present with DCI Brooks. Prince George began to suspect that his new protection officer was operating under different guidelines than her predecessor had been. After his piano lesson, Prince George asked D.I. Mitchell if he might visit the castle's library to select some books for evening reading. This was a routine request that had never presented any complications with DCI Brooks, but D.I. Mitchell paused before responding, as though she needed to check whether such a simple activity was permissible. "Of course, Your Royal Highness," she said after a moment's hesitation. "I'll just need to confirm the security arrangements for the library access." Prince George watched as D.I. Mitchell stepped aside to make another radio communication, this one longer and more detailed than the previous ones. He couldn't hear the entire conversation, but he caught enough fragments to understand that she was seeking permission for something that should have been a routine part of his daily activities. When D.I. Mitchell returned, her expression was carefully neutral, but Prince George detected a slight stiffness in her manner. "I'm afraid the library access will need to be postponed until this evening, Your Royal Highness. There are some maintenance activities taking place that make it inadvisable to visit at this time." Prince George knew this was not true. He had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of the castle's maintenance schedules, staff routines, and daily operations through years of careful observation. There was no maintenance work scheduled for the library that afternoon, and even if there had been, it would not have prevented a brief visit to select books from the areas he typically accessed. "I understand," Prince George said politely, though his mind was already processing the implications of this deception. Perhaps this evening would be better. But even as he agreed to the delay, Prince George realized that something fundamental had changed with his security arrangements. D.I. Mitchell was not operating with the same autonomy that DCI Brooks had possessed. She was following much more restrictive protocols, and she was clearly answerable to someone who was monitoring and controlling his movements much more closely than had previously been the case. That evening, during dinner with his parents, Prince George found himself carefully considering how much to share about his observations. The Prince and Princess of Wales had always encouraged their children to communicate openly about their experiences and concerns, but Prince George had also learned to be judicious about when and how to raise sensitive topics. As they discussed the events of their respective days, Prince George mentioned in passing that he had a new protection officer and that he was adjusting to some changes in his routine. His parents responded with the kind of general support and encouragement that loving parents provide, but Prince George noticed that they did not ask for specific details about the changes or express any particular curiosity about the circumstances of DCI Brooks's departure. This observation led Prince George to suspect that his parents were either unaware of the specific issues that had led to the resignation, or that they had been given an explanation that differed significantly from the reality he had witnessed. Either possibility was concerning, as it suggested that information was being carefully controlled and managed in ways that might not serve his family's best interests. After dinner, Prince George retired to his private sitting room with several books that a staff member had retrieved from the library for him. As he settled into his favorite reading chair, he found himself thinking not about the adventure stories on his lap, but about the complex adult world that was revealing itself around him. He was beginning to understand that his position as future king made him not just a person to be protected, but also potentially a person to be controlled and manipulated by those with their own agendas. The realization was both sobering and motivating. Prince George understood that he would need to develop not just the formal education that his tutors were providing, but also a sophisticated understanding of human nature, political dynamics, and the ways that power could be exercised both visibly and behind the scenes. DCI Brooks's resignation had been more than just a personnel change. It had been a lesson in the complex realities of his future role and the importance of surrounding himself with people of genuine integrity and courage. The third week following DCI Brooks's departure brought an unexpected development that would reshape everyone's understanding of the situation. Prince George had been scheduled to attend the opening of a new children's wing at St. Mary's Hospital in London, an engagement that had been planned for months and was considered a routine public appearance appropriate for a young member of the royal family. The morning of the hospital visit began with unusual activity in the castle's security control room. D.I. Mitchell had arrived earlier than normal and was engaged in lengthy conversations with multiple palace officials, their voices carrying an urgency that was unfamiliar to the regular staff. Mrs. Whitfield, making her routine rounds of the public areas, noticed that several individuals she didn't recognize were present in the castle, all wearing the discreet earpieces and formal attire that identified them as additional security personnel. Prince George, preparing for the engagement with his usual attention to detail, was aware of the heightened activity around him. His morning routine had been interrupted twice by requests to modify his schedule, and he noticed that D.I. Mitchell seemed particularly tense as she reviewed what appeared to be updated security protocols on her tablet device. "Your Royal Highness," D.I. Mitchell said as Prince George finished his breakfast, "there have been some adjustments to today's schedule. The hospital visit will proceed as planned, but there will be some modifications to the route and timing." Prince George nodded politely, but internally he was analyzing every aspect of D.I. Mitchell's demeanor and the information she was providing. The adjustments she mentioned were being presented as routine updates, but her body language suggested something far more significant was taking place. "Will my parents be joining me for any part of today's engagement?" Prince George asked, though he already knew the answer from his original briefing materials. "No, Your Royal Highness. This remains a solo engagement for you, as originally planned. However, there will be additional support staff accompanying us today." Prince George understood that additional support staff was code for increased security presence, which raised immediate questions about what kind of threat assessment had prompted such measures. In his experience, changes to security arrangements were typically explained to him in age-appropriate terms, but D.I. Mitchell was providing no context for these modifications. As they departed Windsor Castle for the journey to London, Prince George observed the convoy of vehicles that comprised their motorcade. Instead of the usual two-car arrangement, there were now 4 vehicles involved, with additional protection officers visible in each one. The lead vehicle, which normally carried advanced security personnel, appeared to have been replaced with a different model, and the communications equipment visible through the windows was more extensive than he had previously observed. During the 40-minute journey to London, Prince George noticed that their route was different from the one typically used for hospital visits. Instead of taking the most direct path, they were following a more circuitous route that avoided certain main roads and included several unexpected turns. When he mentioned this observation to D.I. Mitchell, she explained that traffic conditions had necessitated the alternative route, but Prince George could see from the relatively clear roads around them that traffic was not the actual reason for these changes. Most significantly, Prince George realized that their ultimate destination was not St. Mary's Hospital as originally planned. As they approached central London, the convoy turned toward a different area of the city entirely. When the motorcade finally stopped, they were outside Royal London Hospital, a completely different medical facility from the one where his engagement was supposed to take place. D.I. Mitchell, Prince George said as calmly as possible, "I believe there may be some confusion about our destination. My engagement today was scheduled for St. Mary's Hospital, not Royal London Hospital." D.I. Mitchell turned to face Prince George with an expression that combined reassurance with something that looked like apology. "Your Royal Highness, there has been a change of venue for security reasons. The hospital staff and the children you were scheduled to meet have been relocated to Royal London Hospital for today's event. Everything else about your engagement remains exactly the same." Prince George knew immediately that this explanation was false. Relocating an entire hospital opening ceremony, complete with staff, patients, and media coverage, was not something that could be arranged on short notice for security reasons. Such an event involved months of planning, coordination with multiple agencies, and logistical arrangements that could not be simply transferred from one location to another. More troubling still, Prince George realized that if the venue had been legitimately changed, his parents and their private secretaries would have been informed, and he would have received proper notification through official channels. The fact that he was learning about this change only upon arrival suggested that this was not an authorized modification to his schedule. As they exited the convoy and approached the hospital entrance, Prince George made a decision that would later be recognized as a defining moment in his young life. Instead of following D.I. Mitchell toward the main entrance, he stopped walking and stood completely still on the pavement outside the building. "Your Royal Highness," D.I. Mitchell said, turning back toward him with obvious concern, "is there something wrong? We're expected inside in just a few minutes." Prince George looked directly at his protection officer, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his royal heritage. "D.I. Mitchell, I would like you to contact my father's private secretary immediately and confirm the details of today's engagement." "Sir, that's not necessary," D.I. Mitchell replied, her professional composure beginning to show signs of strain. I can assure you that everything has been properly coordinated. Nevertheless, Prince George said with perfect calm, I would like that confirmation before we proceed. For several long moments, they stood facing each other on the busy London street while photographers and curious onlookers began to gather at a respectful distance. D.I. Mitchell was clearly receiving instructions through her earpiece, and Prince George could see her internal struggle as she attempted to balance her orders with the young prince's unexpected assertiveness. Your Royal Highness, D.I. Mitchell said finally, I'm afraid there isn't time for additional confirmations. We have a schedule to maintain, and the hospital staff are waiting for our arrival. Prince George understood that this response confirmed his suspicions. In any legitimate change of plans, contacting his father's office would be not just appropriate, but mandatory. The fact that D.I. Mitchell was resisting such a reasonable request meant that this engagement was not what it appeared to be. Without saying another word, Prince George turned and began walking back toward the convoy of vehicles. His movement was deliberate and unhurried, but his intention was unmistakably clear. He was not going to participate in whatever had been planned for him at this hospital. Your Royal Highness, please, D.I. Mitchell called after him, now clearly distressed. You cannot simply leave. There are security protocols that must be followed. Prince George stopped and turned back to face her one final time. D.I. Mitchell, he said in a voice that carried both kindness and absolute finality. My security is my paramount concern. And, right now, I do not feel secure proceeding with this engagement. The statement was delivered with such dignity and conviction that even the gathering crowd of onlookers seemed to sense they were witnessing something significant. Prince George was not throwing a childish tantrum or making unreasonable demands. He was making a mature, considered decision based on his assessment of a situation that he recognized as potentially dangerous. At that moment, as if summoned by some invisible signal, 3 additional vehicles arrived on the scene with remarkable speed. From the lead vehicle emerged Detective Chief Inspector Brooks, still wearing his Metropolitan Police credentials, accompanied by 2 senior officers that Prince George didn't recognize. The relief on the young prince's face was immediately visible, and, for the first time that morning, his composure showed signs of the emotional strain he had been managing. DCI Brooks approached Prince George with the professional bearing that had characterized their previous interactions. But there was also something different in his expression, a combination of concern, determination, and what looked like pride in his young charge's handling of the situation. Your Royal Highness, DCI Brooks said formally, I apologize for any confusion about today's arrangements. There have been some developments that require immediate attention to your security protocols. With your permission, I would like to escort you to a secure location where we can sort out these issues properly. Prince George nodded without hesitation. Thank you, DCI Brooks. I would very much appreciate that. As they moved toward DCI Brooks's vehicle, Prince George could see D.I. Mitchell speaking urgently into her radio, clearly reporting this unexpected turn of events to whoever had been coordinating the day's activities. The additional security personnel who had accompanied her were now standing awkwardly nearby, uncertain about how to proceed in this rapidly evolving situation. Before getting into the vehicle with DCI Brooks, Prince George turned back toward D.I. Mitchell one final time. D.I. Mitchell, he said with genuine courtesy, thank you for your service. I hope you understand that my decision today was not a reflection of your personal conduct, but rather my response to circumstances that I believe required immediate attention. The grace and maturity with which Prince George handled this confrontation would later be remarked upon by everyone who witnessed it. Here was an 11-year-old child who had found himself in what was clearly a complex and potentially dangerous situation, and he had responded not with panic or anger, but with the kind of measured judgment and diplomatic skill that suggested he was already developing the qualities that would serve him well as a future monarch. As their vehicle pulled away from Royal London Hospital, DCI Brooks briefed Prince George on what had actually been planned for that morning. The hospital engagement had been an elaborate deception designed to place the young prince in a situation where his movements would be controlled by individuals who were not operating under legitimate royal protection protocols. The hospital itself was real, but the supposed opening ceremony was entirely fabricated, and the staff who were waiting inside were not medical professionals, but individuals whose backgrounds and intentions remained under investigation. Your Royal Highness, DCI Brooks said as they made their way to a secure location, your decision to stop and question the arrangements may well have prevented a serious incident. Your instincts were absolutely correct, and your response was both brave and wise. Prince George absorbed this information with the same composure he had shown throughout the morning's events. DCI Brooks, he replied, I remembered what you told me about the importance of trusting the people around me. When I realized that I couldn't trust what was happening today, I knew I needed to find someone I could trust. The simple clarity of this statement encapsulated everything that made Prince George's response so remarkable. Despite his young age, he had developed the ability to assess complex situations, recognize potential threats, and take decisive action to protect himself while maintaining his dignity and treating others with respect. It was a demonstration of leadership that few adults could have managed under similar circumstances. The investigation that followed Prince George's refusal to participate in the fabricated hospital engagement revealed a conspiracy that reached deeper into the palace hierarchy than anyone had initially suspected. Within hours of the incident at Royal London Hospital, the Metropolitan Police's Special Investigations Unit had launched a comprehensive review of royal protection protocols, palace staff backgrounds, and the chain of command that had allowed such a serious security breach to occur. Chief Superintendent Walsh found herself coordinating between multiple agencies as the scope of the investigation expanded. The security services had been brought in to assess potential national security implications, while internal palace investigators were reviewing years of personnel decisions and security modifications. What emerged was a picture of systematic compromise that had been developing gradually over more than 18 months. The individual who had been orchestrating the security modifications was eventually identified as Sir Reginald Heartfelt, a senior palace administrator who had held a trusted position in the royal household for nearly a decade. Sir Reginald's motivations remained unclear, but evidence suggested that he had been recruited by foreign interests seeking to gain access to detailed information about royal family movements, security arrangements, and private communications. The plan involving the fake hospital engagement appeared to have been designed not to harm Prince George directly, but rather to place him in a controlled environment where sophisticated surveillance equipment could be used to gather intelligence about royal protection protocols. The young prince's instinctive refusal to participate had prevented what could have been a significant compromise of national security information. In the days that followed, Prince George found himself at the center of discussions about royal security that involved his parents, senior palace officials, and the highest levels of the Metropolitan Police. For the first time in his life, he was being treated not just as a child who needed to be protected, but as an individual whose judgment and observations were valued and respected by the adults responsible for his welfare. During one particularly significant meeting in his father's private office, Prince George was asked to provide a detailed account of everything he had observed in the weeks leading up to the incident. His recall of specific conversations, behavioral changes among staff members, and subtle modifications to his daily routine proved to be remarkably accurate and provided investigators with crucial details that helped them understand the full extent of the conspiracy. George, his father said at the conclusion of this briefing, I want you to understand how proud we are of the way you handled this situation. Your ability to recognize that something was wrong, and your courage in refusing to go along with arrangements that didn't feel right, may have prevented something much more serious from happening. Prince George received this praise with the same thoughtful dignity that had characterized his response throughout the crisis. Father, he replied, I think I was able to recognize the problems because DCI Brooks taught me to pay attention to the behavior of the people around me. When he resigned, I understood that it was because he couldn't do his job properly anymore. That made me realize I needed to be more careful about trusting other people's decisions. This observation led to a broader conversation about the responsibilities that came with Prince George's position and the importance of developing his own judgment about the people and situations he would encounter throughout his life. His parents recognized that their son had already begun developing the kind of discernment that would be essential for his future role, and they made the decision to include him more directly in discussions about his security and public responsibilities. DCI Brooks was not only reinstated to his position as Prince George's primary protection officer, but was also promoted to Detective Chief Inspector with special responsibilities for reviewing and strengthening royal protection protocols. His willingness to resign rather than compromise his professional standards had ultimately been vindicated, and his decision was now being used as a case study in professional integrity within the Metropolitan Police. Your Royal Highness, DCI Brooks said during their first meeting after his return, I want you to know that your support during my most difficult professional moment meant more to me than you can probably understand. When you spoke to me about integrity and doing the right thing, it gave me the confidence I needed to follow through with my decision. Prince George considered this statement carefully before responding. DCI Brooks, he said, I think what happened taught both of us something important about leadership. Sometimes a leader has to make decisions that other people don't understand or agree with. But if those decisions are based on the right principles, they usually turn out to be correct in the end. The wisdom embedded in this observation was not lost on any of the adults present. Here was an 11-year-old who had not only navigated a complex and potentially dangerous situation with remarkable skill, but who was also developing a sophisticated understanding of the principles that would guide his future leadership. The broader implications of the security breach led to comprehensive reforms in royal protection protocols. New procedures were implemented to ensure that no single individual could authorize significant changes to security arrangements without multiple levels of review and approval. Background checks for palace staff were strengthened, and new systems were put in place to monitor and verify the authenticity of all public engagements and schedule modifications. Perhaps most significantly, the incident led to a new recognition of Prince George's developing maturity and judgment. While he would continue to receive the protection and guidance appropriate for his age, there was now an understanding that his observations and concerns should be taken seriously and that he should be included in age-appropriate discussions about his security and public responsibilities. 6 months after the hospital incident, Prince George attended a legitimate opening ceremony at a children's medical facility in Edinburgh. The event proceeded without incident, but those who observed the young prince that day noted a new confidence and awareness in his demeanor. He interacted with staff and patients with his customary warmth and genuine interest, but there was also a watchful quality to his behavior that suggested he was continuously assessing his environment and the people around him. During the return journey to Windsor Castle, Prince George sat quietly with DCI Brooks, reviewing the day's events in the thoughtful way that had become his habit after public engagements. DCI Brooks, he said eventually, do you think what happened with the hospital situation will happen again? DCI Brooks considered the question seriously before answering. Your Royal Highness, I think there will always be people who might try to take advantage of your position for their own purposes. But I also think that what you learned from that experience has made you much better prepared to recognize and respond to such situations in the future. I hope so, Prince George replied. I've been thinking about what my grandmother told me about the crown being a symbol of service. I think that means I have a responsibility not just to be protected by good people, but also to make sure that I can recognize good people and support them when they're trying to do the right thing. This reflection captured the essence of what Prince George had learned from the entire experience. The crisis had taught him that his position would make him a target for those with questionable motives, but it had also shown him that he possessed the judgment and courage necessary to protect himself and support those who served him with integrity. The lessons learned during those challenging weeks would stay with Prince George throughout his adolescence and into his adult life. He had discovered that effective leadership sometimes requires making difficult decisions based on incomplete information, that the people closest to you can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest risks, and that true security comes not just from external protection but from developing your own ability to assess and respond to complex situations. Most importantly, Prince George had learned that the qualities that would make him an effective future monarch, integrity, courage, wisdom, and the ability to inspire loyalty in others, were not abstract concepts to be studied in textbooks, but practical skills that needed to be developed through real-world experience and tested under pressure. As the royal convoy made its way through the Scottish countryside toward the airport, Prince George gazed out at the landscape and thought about the future that awaited him. He understood now that his path to the throne would involve not just formal education and ceremonial preparation, but also the continuous development of his character and judgment. The incident with DCI Brooks and the fabricated hospital engagement had been his first real test of leadership, and he had passed it with a grace and wisdom that suggested he would be ready for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The young prince who had once moved through Windsor Castle with the carefree confidence of childhood was now developing into someone who understood the weight of his future responsibilities while maintaining the essential qualities of compassion, humility, and genuine care for others that would define his reign when the time came. The crisis had marked not just a turning point in his security arrangements, but the beginning of his transformation from a protected child into a future leader who could protect others through the strength of his character and the wisdom of his judgment.